Hi, I'm Pastor Stephanie Late from Cross and Crown Lutheran Church. Hope you're doing well today. I said last week that I would start a series, a few videos on how to understand the Bible. And that's because, well, I guess it's pretty obvious that pastors talk about the Bible a lot, but also people call me a lot from my congregation and outside of my congregation, just knowing that they want to understand some kind of a Bible passage and feeling like it's confusing. And it is confusing. I get that. I mean, it's a complicated book. There are 66 books in the Bible. They're all very different from one another. They all mean different things, and there are different ways to interpret all of them. So pastors do go through a lot of schooling to understand this, but I think that there are a few key things, a few principles that are really helpful to keep in mind. And if you keep these few things, it's not a lot, but if you just keep these few principles in mind, then it will go a long way to helping you understand any particular passage. So rather than going through every book in the Bible and talking about everything, I do that too, in Bible studies. But rather than going through that right now, I just thought it would be good to talk about these basic principles. So if somebody calls me and says, I don't understand this passage in Second Kings, or I don't understand this passage in Matthew, or whatever, before even talking about the passage, I kind of back up and say, okay, well, before talking about that, there's a few foundational things to keep in mind about the Bible in general. And it sounds kind of like maybe I'm not answering the question specifically, but I'll get to it about the passage in whatever book. But you got to have the foundation to get why I'm saying what I'm saying. So in biblical studies, there's nobody that has the absolute handle on all truth. This is a lifetime of studying this book, this sacred text. And we got to hold on to it humbly, knowing that there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of mystery. And it's our understanding anyway as Lutherans, and maybe, different denominations understand this differently, but it's our understanding as Lutherans that our correct theology or our correct biblical studies won't save us. So it's not even a big deal if you get it wrong, because your salvation or your okayness in the world or in the afterlife isn't contingent on understanding everything about the Bible perfectly or never making a mistake in interpretation or whatever. So I'm very comfortable with saying that there's a lot I don't know, and I think that a lot of biblical scholars and teachers and pastors and theologians are pretty comfortable with that. But there are some things we can't understand. Okay, so last week I talked about some basic ways to understand the Bible, and you can go back and look at that first video if you want to hear that, if you have not heard that yet. And then today, what I want to talk about is the difference between the understanding of the Bible being inspired or inerrant. So that's what this is going to be about. So our denomination, we are the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, ELCA. I'm talking about how we see things, not about how every Christian sees things. Now, lots of other Christians other than the ELCA see it the way I'm going to describe it. Lots do, but not all do. So if you go to your local pastor or the pastor down the street from you or whatever and say, do you agree with this? That pastor very well could say, no, that's not how we understand it, because this is a difference in understanding the Bible. I'm Lutheran because I chose it, because I wasn't raised a Lutheran, but this theology and this understanding makes the most sense to me. And so this is obviously what I believe as a Christian, but it's not universal to all Christians. So we believe the Bible to be inspired by God. And that means that God gave God's Spirit to the original authors of the Bible. The Catholic Bible has more books in it than 66, but the Protestant Bible, and Lutherans are Protestant, we have 66 books of the Bible. So our understanding in what's called the canon of the Bible, and as Protestants, the canon is 66 books. In the canon, and that's spelled C-A-N-O-N, spelled differently than the weapon canon. In the canon, we believe that God inspired, and the word, if you break down inspired, means put the Spirit in somebody as an author. Inspired people, lots of people, to write the Bible. So the Bible is like a library of books, and they were written with God's Spirit leading them. But they also were written in specific historical and cultural contexts. So the people that wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and all that, they lived in a specific historical time and place. And all of us cannot help but be influenced by our culture. We literally can't help it. So I'm influenced as a 21st century American, Californian. I'm influenced by the fact that I'm a female, that I'm of European descent. Like there are these things that influence all of us in our time and place. And so that includes the authors of the text. Now, this is different than in world religions if you study Islam. If you study Islam, the belief of Islam is that the Quran, the sacred text of that religion, was handed over from God through the angels to Muhammad, literally word for word correct, not inspired. Not that Muhammad was inspired to write some things, but that it was verbatim dictated. That's not the belief in Christianity, in most of Christianity anyway. So the predominant belief for 2,000 years in Christianity is that the Bible has been inspired, but not that it's been inerrant. Now, inerrant means without error, like without human error. The majority of Christians for 2,000 years, including Catholics and Lutherans and Episcopalian and Orthodox and Methodists and Presbyterians and on, we would all say, yeah, there's some human error. We can't help it. We are products of our culture. So there's room for error. So for instance, there's a part in the Bible that says if your child disobeys you, take them out to the courtyard and stone them to death. Well, that might be human error. That's not very godlike. That's not very Jesus-y. Maybe that person is influenced by their culture, that's how, it's okay to treat children like that because children were thought to be property in that time and place. Another situation is where in the Old Testament, God supposedly tells the Israelites to, not only conquer the Philistines and take their land, but to smash the Philistines' children, dash their heads against rocks and murder them. Well, again, that's human error. That's tribal warfare. That's what people do when there are tribes fighting over land. And to put those words into the mouth of God might be human error. At least can we see that it's a possibility that maybe the person is interpreting it through their own lens of how they understand things? Another example is in the Psalms. These are all these poems and prayers to God. Many of them are praises and, thanks to God for all kinds of things. But then there are these occasional, God, you've abandoned me. Well, couldn't that be not so much theology in terms of truth, because we don't believe God ever abandons people, but could that just be a human psychological response to going through some kind of a huge trial? We've all felt that from time to time, that God's abandoned us. And so it's an authentic prayer from someone who's suffering. But it's not true in terms of God has abandoned the person. So therefore, there is some human error. Now, next week, I'll do a talk about how to understand which is the human error and to discern, okay, how is this understood as human error versus the truth of God? Because there are ways to parse that out. Women shouldn't speak. That kind of a thing. Could that be a cultural, contextual thing and not necessarily the truth of God? So our understanding in our denomination and in many others, and it was the case for thousands of years, is that the Bible is not inerrant, which is like how the Quran would be understood, where no mark of it can be changed. It's just literally dictated from God. Or do we understand it as inspired? Well, the very common understanding was that it was inspired but not inerrant. Martin Luther liked some biblical books more than others. He couldn't stand the book of James, for instance. He called it the Gospel of Straw. He really didn't like it. And he really didn't like Revelation until later on when he learned to appreciate it. So, he didn't believe that every mark of the Bible was as equally valid as every other mark of the Bible. He was a great theologian. He loved the Word of God. He considered the Bible what he called the cradle of Christ, the way we can come to understand Christ. We don't worship the Bible. That would be idolatry. The Bible is not God, but it's a way to come to God and understand God. So he loved the Bible, but he did not consider all of the books equally valid or equally instructive for us, but very much inspired and a way to understand God. So in our country, in the United States, where this flipped was during the 1800s when the pioneers were coming west and, packing up their covered wagons and coming from the eastern states and some of the Midwestern states over more toward the West Coast. They could not pack up in their covered wagons all of the so-called trappings of church. They couldn't pack up their brick and stone buildings. They couldn't pack up all of their paraments, which is all of the banners and the cloths and the robes and, the incense and the candles and the stained glass windows and all of that. They couldn't take all of that stuff. What they could do is they could throw a Bible. I mean, not throw, that sounds disrespectful, but like put a Bible into their covered wagon. And some of these people were not trained theologians or clergy, but they went west. And they went west with their Bible, and they would set up these big tent revival meetings, and they would have all these people come, and they did not have the normal, what people were used to about the church with the stained glass windows and the, on and on and on. But they had a Bible, and they would preach from the Bible, which is great, which is fine. But the Bible became front and center, and it became everything to the people because that's all they had. And then there were people, again, that were not trained theologians to understand how to interpret the Bible. So every word of the Bible seemed as equally valid and as equally applicable as every other word of the Bible. Moving further west, and I live on the West Coast, there's a huge history on the West Coast of people believing the Bible is inerrant, without error. And when you meet folks like that on the West Coast, they think you're weird if you don't believe the Bible is inerrant. They think that it's been like the thing for thousands of years to believe the Bible has no error. And that's not true. That's a more modern concept that the Bible has no error. We believe the Bible does have contextual error. Not that the people tried to have error, but they're products of their culture. And again, there are ways to discern which is which and what is what, and we'll get into that later. But it's more common, it's more historical to not think of the Bible like the Quran, where no word can be changed, where everything is directly from the mouth of God, where there's no error. It's more common to think, yeah, there are contextual and cultural errors, but that the Bible is inspired. So that's one tool to keep in your back pocket. If you want to understand the Bible like I do and like our denomination does, maybe you don't. Maybe you understand the Bible to be inerrant and without error. And if you understand it that way, that's fine. That's a choice, but you've got a lot of explaining to do. If you think that the Bible is without error, then how do you make sense of stone a child to death if they disobey you? Literally, how do you make sense of that? How do you make sense of women should always cover their heads? It's a sin to wear mixed fabric, like a polycotton blend. If you're taking everything literally and without error, you've got a lot of explaining to do. And that's going to be a lot more complicated. Hope this makes sense. Hey, get a hold of me if you have any questions. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about it all day, every day. I love biblical studies so much. And we will continue this next week. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.